The surveyor showed up to prove the tree was his. Instead, he proved it belonged to no one. What I did the next morning cost me nothing and ended an 11-year war. I never thought a tree could teach me something about myself. But then again, I never expected to spend 11 years of my life arguing about one either. Let me start from the beginning, because this story doesn't make sense without context. My name is Daniel Marsh. I'm a 43-year-old high school history teacher in a mid-sized town in rural Ohio. I live in the house I grew up in, a 2-story craftsman with green shutters and a wraparound porch that my grandfather built in 1952. I inherited it from my mother when she passed in 2013, and I moved in with my wife, Claire, and our then 8-year-old daughter, Nora. The house sat on a half-acre lot backed by mature trees and bordered to the east by a shared gravel driveway easement and, on the west side, by a property line that ran through, or near, as it turned out, the base of the most magnificent white oak tree I had ever seen. That tree was old. Not old, the way people say about a 50-year-old maple. Old the way mountains are old. Its trunk was nearly 6 feet in diameter at the base. Its canopy stretched across portions of both yards like a cathedral ceiling. In autumn, my daughter used to stand beneath it and spin with her arms out while leaves fell around her like copper snow. I have photographs of her doing this at age 8, 10, 12, 15. The tree was a fixed point in our lives. A landmark. A living thing I associated with everything good about the house and the neighborhood and the slow, seasonal permanence of the place I called home. The Garfields moved in next door in 2013, the same summer I inherited the house. Gerald Garfield was a retired civil engineer from Cleveland who had relocated with his wife, Pamela, and their adult son, Marcus, who worked remotely in finance. They were not unpleasant people, initially. We introduced ourselves over the fence. We exchanged casseroles. Gerald seemed like a practical, precise man, the kind who measures twice before cutting once and then cuts anyway, because cutting is what you do with things that interfere with your plans. The first mention of the tree came in October of 2013. Gerald knocked on my door, clipboard in hand, which I would later understand was just his natural resting state, and pointed toward the oak. "That tree drops debris on my roof," he said. "I'd like to discuss having it removed." I told him I didn't want it removed. "It's on the property line," he said. "We both have rights to it." "Then we both have the right to keep it," I said. He looked at me the way engineers look at problems that haven't yet agreed to be solved. He nodded slowly, thanked me for my time, and left. I didn't know it then, but that conversation was the opening move of an 11-year game neither of us fully understood we were playing. The early years, 2013 to 2017 escalation by increment. The conflict didn't explode immediately. Gerald was a methodical man, and methodical people wage methodical wars. The first phase was what I came to call the documentation phase. He began photographing the tree. Not casually, systematically. Every storm, he would send me a certified letter with photographs of branches on his roof, debris in his gutters, shadows across his solar panels, root encroachment near his foundation. The letters were always professional in tone and always concluded with the same polite but firm request: remove the tree, or allow him to remove it at his cost. I consulted an arborist after the third letter. The arborist, a cheerful woman named Sandra who clearly loved trees the way some people love dogs, confirmed what I already believed. The oak was healthy, structurally sound, and estimated to be between 180 and 220 years old. She also confirmed something I filed away carefully. White oaks of that age and size were increasingly rare in residential settings and had measurable ecological and property value. She estimated the tree's appraised value, not the lumber, but the living tree, at somewhere between $25,000 and $40,000. I sent Gerald a copy of the arborist's report. He sent me a letter from a different arborist who said the tree posed a risk to structures during high wind events. And so it went. Letter for letter. Report for report. Seasons turned. In 2015, Gerald hired a landscaping crew to trim branches on his side of the property line. I came home from school to find 4 major limbs cut, not trimmed, removed, the cuts jagged and poorly angled, the kind of cuts that introduce disease into a tree. Sandra told me later that the cuts were aggressive and not consistent with professional arboricultural standards. I hired an attorney for the first time. She sent Gerald a cease and desist letter citing Ohio's shared tree law, which holds that a tree sitting on a property line is jointly owned and that neither party can remove or materially damage it without the other's consent. Gerald's attorney replied that his client had acted within his rights to trim branches extending over his property. Back and forth. Year after year. By 2017, we had both spent money we didn't need to spend. We had both accumulated files of documentation. We had both developed a kind of muscle memory for hostility, the tension that comes from living next to someone you are technically at war with, the stiffness that sets in when you see their car in the driveway, the way you start measuring the world in terms of what they might do next. Claire handled it better than I did. She was a yoga instructor with what I can only describe as an adversity immune system. She never stopped waving at Pamela Garfield when she saw her in the yard. She once brought over a pie during what I considered active hostilities, which sent me into a minor private spiral. Nora, who was now 12, had decided the whole thing was embarrassing and had written both families off as ridiculous. She was not wrong. Update 1. The Surveyor Question, 2018. The conflict entered a new phase in 2018 when Gerald, apparently unsatisfied with the documentary war, filed a formal complaint with the county requesting a property line adjudication. This was an escalation I had not anticipated. The complaint alleged ambiguity in the recorded plat and requested that a licensed surveyor be assigned to formally mark the boundary between our two properties. My attorney called me the evening she received the notification. He's trying to establish that the tree sits entirely on his side, she explained. If he can prove the boundary runs east of the trunk center, the shared tree doctrine no longer applies. Can he prove that? I asked. That depends on the survey, she said. These old lots sometimes have discrepancies between the original plat and current physical markers. It's not unusual. I authorized the survey. I figured I would accept whatever the boundary showed. The tree had stood for 2 centuries. It had been planted or had seeded itself long before either family's deed existed. Whatever the law said about ownership, I knew what I believed about the tree's right to stand. The surveyor, a quiet, meticulous man named Robert Ellison who worked for the county assessor's office, arrived on a Tuesday morning in March 2018. Gerald was there with a cup of coffee and, naturally, a clipboard. I stood on my porch with my own coffee and watched. Ellison worked for 4 hours. He used GPS equipment, referenced the original 1887 plat records, measured from fixed monuments, and made notes I couldn't read from my distance. Gerald hovered. I tried not to hover, which meant I stood at my kitchen window looking like someone who was definitely not hovering. Ellison packed up his equipment in the early afternoon and told both of us he would file his report within 2 weeks. The 2 weeks passed with a particular kind of suspended tension, the kind where everyone knows something is about to change but nobody knows which way it will fall. When the report arrived, I read it 3 times before I understood what it said. The surveyor had identified a discrepancy in the original plat that had gone unnoticed for over 100 years. The boundary between the two properties, as originally recorded, contained a small geometrical irregularity, a surveying error from 1887 that resulted in a gap. A thin, irregular strip of land, roughly 8 feet wide at its widest point and tapering to about 3 feet at its narrowest, running along approximately 60 feet of what everyone had always assumed was the shared boundary. The oak tree, all 6 feet of its trunk base, sat entirely within this strip of land. The strip belonged to neither the Marsh property nor the Garfield property. It was, in the formal language of the report, an unresolved remnant parcel that had never been deeded to any private owner and had never been transferred to the municipality. In the eyes of Ohio property law, it was unclaimed land. I stared at the report until the words blurred. Then I called my attorney. Update 2. The claim, spring 2018. My attorney's name was Helen Park, and she had been practicing real estate law in Ohio for 22 years. When I read her the surveyor's summary over the phone, there was a silence on her end that I had never heard from her before, a silence that sounded, if I'm being precise, like controlled excitement. "Daniel," she said, "do you understand what this means?" "Tell me," I said. "It means Gerald Garfield has been trying to cut down a tree he had absolutely no legal interest in for 5 years," she said. "And it means that tree is currently sitting on land that anyone can potentially claim." She explained the mechanism to me in the careful, methodical language of someone who wanted to make certain I understood every step. Ohio, like most states, recognizes a legal process called adverse possession, through which a private party can claim title to land they have continuously, openly, and exclusively occupied for a statutory period. In Ohio, 21 years. But she told me that was not the most immediate path. The more direct route was a quiet title action combined with a petition to the county, given that the parcel appeared to have originated from a plat error and had never been formally transferred or claimed. "How long would that take?" I asked. 6 months to a year for an uncontested claim, she said. Faster if the county cooperates, which they often do with remnant parcels. They don't want them either. "And if Gerald files the same claim?" There was a pause. "Whoever files first has the stronger position," she said. "And you called me tonight." I told her to file. I want to be honest here about something, because this story would be less true if I left it out. In that moment, I was not thinking about justice or strategy or the tree's preservation. I was thinking about Gerald Garfield's face. I was thinking about 5 years of certified letters and arborists and attorneys and clipped branches and the slow, grinding exhaustion of living next to someone who wanted to take something from you and had decided that wanting it hard enough was sufficient justification. I wanted to win. I want to be honest about that. But I also want to say that by the time I went to bed that night, something else had settled in me. Something quieter. The tree had been there for 200 years. It would outlive both of us if we let it. The question was whether two families who had spent 5 years fighting over a boundary could, in some form, find a different relationship to a piece of ground that the law said belonged to neither of them. I didn't know the answer yet. But I had begun to ask the question, which felt like something. Helen filed the quiet title petition with the county on a Thursday morning in April 2018. By Monday, Gerald Garfield had received notice, and by Wednesday, he had filed his own competing claim through his attorney. The ground was formally contested. Update 3. The long process, 2018 to 2022. I will compress what followed, because it took 4 years and much of it was procedural in ways that are genuinely difficult to make compelling. But here are the essential movements. The county conducted its own title search and confirmed the surveyor's findings. The remnant parcel, which the assessor's office assigned the informal designation Gap Parcel 7, Millbrook Township, had never been transferred to any private owner. Its origin was a surveying error in the 1887 plat that had been compounded by 2 subsequent boundary surveys in 1931 and 1968 that had each used the erroneous plat as their reference, essentially copying the mistake forward through time. Both families had deeds that referenced the same incorrectly surveyed boundary. Both families had believed, reasonably and in good faith, that the property line was where everyone thought it was. The oak tree had stood in the gap, rooted in ground that technically belonged to history, for longer than anyone's living memory. Gerald hired a second attorney who was, I'll give him this, very good. His strategy had 2 prongs. First, he argued that the Garfield family, as the party seeking the removal of the tree, had a superior equitable interest in the parcel because its removal would serve a legitimate property improvement purpose. This argument did not survive early review. Courts are generally uninterested in, I want to cut it down, as a basis for property rights. His second argument was more sophisticated, adverse possession through the actions of his predecessor in title. The property next to mine had changed hands twice before the Garfields. Gerald's attorney argued that the previous owners of the lot had maintained the eastern edge of the gap parcel, mowing, trimming, general upkeep, for a continuous period sufficient to establish an adverse possession claim that would have accrued to the Garfield property line by inheritance through the deed chain. This argument had teeth. Helen told me it would require an evidentiary hearing. Between 2019 and 2021, we gathered evidence. I interviewed elderly neighbors who had lived on the street since the 1960s. I pulled 30 years of aerial photographs from the county GIS archive. I found a woman named Edna Slattery who had lived 2 doors down since 1971 and remembered, with remarkable clarity, that the area around the oak had always been considered its own thing, that no one mowed immediately around it, that children from multiple properties played under it, that it was a shared landmark rather than anyone's private territory. Edna's deposition took 2 hours. She was 81 years old and remembered the tree the way people remember beloved relatives, with specific details, with emotion, with the particular authority of someone who had been paying attention for decades. She testified that no single property owner had ever exclusively maintained the immediate area around the oak. She testified that she had personally witnessed children from 3 different families playing under it over 50 years without anyone claiming it as private. Gerald's adverse possession argument began to soften. During this period, something else happened that I had not expected. Pamela Garfield knocked on my door in the spring of 2021. I should give you some context about Pamela. She was a quieter presence in this conflict than her husband, a retired librarian who grew tomatoes in the summer and was, as far as I could tell, fundamentally reasonable. I had always suspected the tree dispute was primarily Gerald's project, driven by Gerald's engineers need to resolve what he experienced as a structural variable in his environment. Pamela had never seemed invested in the conflict the way Gerald was. She stood on my porch with a slightly apologetic expression and asked if she could speak with me. We sat on the porch and drank iced tea, and she told me that Gerald had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease the previous fall. That the diagnosis had shifted some things in his perspective. That he was still proceeding with the legal claim, she was honest about that, but that she wanted me to know that on a personal level, she was tired of the fight. I don't think either of us is a bad person, she said. I don't think you are either, I said. We sat quietly for a moment with the oak visible from where we sat, its canopy moving in a light spring wind. It's a beautiful tree, she said, and the way she said it, slightly helplessly, as if the tree itself had done something to her, told me everything I needed to know about how she had always privately felt. I didn't tell Helen about the conversation immediately, but I thought about it for a long time. Update 4. The mediation offer, 2022 to 2023. The evidentiary hearing was scheduled for October 2022. By August, we had completed discovery, submitted our respective documentary evidence, and prepared our witnesses. Helen estimated costs to that point had exceeded $18,000 on my side. Gerald had almost certainly spent more. 3 weeks before the hearing, Helen called me with news. Gerald's attorney has reached out, she said. He wants to discuss mediation. I asked what had changed. Gerald's health has declined, she said. The family is making decisions about the property. I think they're looking at a future where the fight doesn't make sense anymore. I sat with that for a moment. I had waited 4 years for this. I had spent money I hadn't planned to spend, time I couldn't recover, emotional energy I hadn't budgeted for. The part of me that had filed the petition at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night in 2018 wanted to push through to the hearing, let the judge rule, and win on the record. But there was the other part. The part that had sat on the porch with Pamela. The part that had read Edna Slattery's deposition and felt something old and collective in her testimony about a tree that had always been everyone's. The part that was, after 11 years, genuinely tired. I told Helen to hear the mediation proposal. It took 3 sessions over 6 weeks. Gerald attended the second and third in person, moving slowly, his hands occasionally trembling, but his mind precise and present. His engineer's brain had not softened, but something behind his eyes had. He looked at me differently than he had in our previous formal interactions. Not warmly, we were not at warmth yet, but without the targeted quality I had been accustomed to. The mediated agreement that emerged was unlike anything either of our attorneys had anticipated at the outset. The Gap Parcel 7, with its ancient oak, would not be transferred to either private owner. Instead, both families agreed to jointly petition the county to accept the parcel as a registered natural heritage site under Ohio's Local Conservation Designation Program. The designation would formally protect the tree from removal for the duration of its natural life. A small, clearly marked easement would be recorded on both deeds acknowledging the parcel status and both families' historical relationship to it. In practical terms, the tree would stay. It would be legally protected. Neither family would own it. But both families' deeds would permanently note their adjacency to a protected natural feature. Gerald Garfield agreed not to pursue its removal. I agreed to share costs of professional arboricultural maintenance going forward, 2 inspections per year, any necessary care, costs split equally. There was one additional term that I had proposed and that, after some negotiation, was accepted. A small engraved marker, bronze, roughly the size of a hardback book, would be placed at the base of the tree. The text was simple. White oak, circa 1810. Neither owned nor unclaimed. A tree belonging to itself and to those who have cared for it. We signed the agreement on a Wednesday afternoon in January 2023, in a conference room that smelled like old carpet and radiator heat. Gerald and I shook hands across the table. His grip was firm. Mine was too. I want to say something, Gerald said. His attorney looked faintly alarmed, as attorneys do when clients speak unprompted. I pushed this too hard, Gerald said. He wasn't looking at me with regret exactly. Gerald Garfield was constitutionally incapable of regret exactly. He was looking at me with the precision of a man who had measured something and found the result honest. I knew I was pushing it too hard after the first 2 years, and I kept going anyway. That was a mistake in judgment. It was the closest thing to an apology that his particular architecture could produce, and I received it as such. I kept fighting when I could have offered to talk, I said. That's on me too. We nodded at each other, not like friends, not yet, maybe not ever fully, but like 2 men who had finally agreed on the measurements. Update 5. What came after, 2023 to 2024? The county accepted the conservation petition in April 2023. The designation came through in September. The marker was installed in October, on a cool Saturday morning when the oak was at peak color, all amber and bronze and deep sienna, the canopy catching the low autumn light the way it always had, indifferent and enormous and old. Claire came with me to watch the installation. Nora drove up from Columbus, where she was finishing her 2nd year of graduate school in environmental biology. I had told her about the resolution, but I hadn't told her about the marker. When she read the text, she pressed her hand flat against the bark for a moment the way she used to do as a child. You should have done this years ago, she said. Yes, I said. But you also couldn't have done it years ago, she said, with the measured fairness of someone who has thought about something carefully. You weren't ready. She was right. Neither family was. Gerald declined to attend the installation. His health had made outdoor events difficult by fall 2023. But Pamela was there, standing a respectful distance away with a thermos of coffee, watching as the marker was set. We didn't speak much. We didn't need to. What changed between the families after the resolution was not a transformation into friendship. I want to be careful here, because stories like this are tempting to resolve into warmth, into reconciliation scenes, into the mutual acknowledgement of past foolishness followed by shared meals and easy laughter. That is not what happened, and saying it happened would be a lie. What happened was quieter than that, and in its quietness, more real. We stopped being at war. The specific, exhausting alertness of living next to an adversary, the way I had trained myself to notice Gerald's car in the driveway, to interpret the sound of his back door, to document any activity near the property line, that stopped. The nervous system recalibration of that alone was significant enough that Claire commented on it. "You sleep differently," she said one morning, about 2 months after the settlement. "Do I?" "You used to wake up whenever you heard something from next door," she said. "You don't anymore." I hadn't known I was doing it. But she was right. In March 2024, Gerald Garfield passed away. He was 73. His obituary noted his career in civil engineering, his love of precise measurement, and his recent efforts to support local conservation in his community, a characterization of the settlement that was generous in its framing and not entirely inaccurate in its spirit. I attended the visitation. I did not know what I would say to Pamela when I reached the front of the line. When I got there, she took my hand in both of hers. "He talked about that tree in the last months," she said. "Not with anger. Just, he'd look out the window at it and talk about how old it was. I think he finally just loved it." I thought about the engineer who had arrived with a clipboard in October 2013, measuring what needed to be managed, cataloging what needed to be resolved. I thought about a man whose relationship with the world was expressed through precise instruments and documented conclusions. I thought about what it must have meant for someone like that to make peace with something he could not measure into submission, a tree that was older than any record of either family, rooted in ground that belonged to no one, answering to no one, indifferent to deeds and surveys and certified letters, alive in a way that preceded and would likely exceed both of our claims on the landscape. Maybe that's what made Gerald so persistent about cutting it down. Not the roof debris or the shadows or the foundation concerns, those were real enough, but they were also manageable. Maybe it was simply that the tree refused to be resolved. That it existed outside the categories his mind needed. That it stood there in its gap of unclaimed ground and simply was, generation after generation, and there was nothing in Gerald's considerable toolkit that could make that make sense in the way he needed things to make sense. And maybe that's why, at the end, he simply started watching it. Reflection: what the tree taught us. It's now early 2025 as I write this. Nora has started her dissertation on urban ecological heritage sites, and she cites our oak in the introduction, an anecdote about what happens when legal categories run out and something older takes over. I sent her the arborist's original report from 2013 to use as a source. Sandra the arborist still visits twice a year. She's enthusiastic about the conservation designation and has begun citing the tree in her own professional presentations as an example of heritage tree protection through community agreement. Last spring she found evidence that a pair of great horned owls had nested in the upper canopy. She texted me a photograph at 6 in the morning. I texted back immediately despite the hour. The legal fees across both families totaled somewhere north of $45,000 by the time everything was concluded. That is a painful number to look at directly. I think about what else that money could have been. I think about it the way you think about a scar, as evidence of something that happened, as a permanent record of decisions made under conditions that no longer exist. What I know now, in the particular clarity of aftermath, is this. The conflict was never about the tree. It was about the line. The need to establish, precisely and permanently, where one person's world ended and another's began. Gerald needed the line in the way engineers need specifications. I needed the line in the way someone who has inherited a beloved thing needs to know they can keep it. The tree, in its indifference to our lines, was an offense to both of those needs simultaneously. It sat in the gap between us and refused to belong to either story. What the survey revealed was that the gap had always been there. We had just agreed, collectively and without examination, to pretend it wasn't. We had drawn our lines over it and called them real and built 11 years of conflict on the assumption that the map and the territory were the same thing. They were not. They never entirely are. I think about this in the context of most of the conflicts I've watched play out over the years, between families, between neighbors, between people who started with a shared fence and ended in depositions. So often the thing being fought over is not the real thing. So often the real thing is the gap, the unexamined space between two people's needs, the unclaimed territory that nobody surveyed carefully enough, the ground where something old and alive has been quietly growing for longer than the argument has existed. The tree is still there. I can see it from my kitchen window on winter mornings when the branches are bare against the gray Ohio sky, When the shape of it is most visible, the vast, asymmetrical spread of 200 years of growth, the trunk wider than my arm span, the roots running deeper than anyone has measured. It stands in its strip of unclaimed earth, and it does what it has always done, which is nothing more or less than continue. Nora called last week to tell me she'd added a line to her dissertation introduction. She read it to me over the phone. The most important thing about the gap parcel was not that it was finally designated protected land. It was that two families, in agreeing to protect it, discovered that the thing they had been fighting over had never needed either of them to survive. It had only needed them to stop. I told her it was good. I know, she said, with the characteristic confidence of someone who has inherited the best parts of both parents and the patience to use them wisely. The oak outside my window is approximately 215 years old. It was alive before Ohio was a state. It will likely be alive long after the houses on either side of it are gone. It has survived Dutch elm disease, a different species, but the ecological losses informed the arborist's assessments, 2 major wind events, the aggressive pruning of 2015, 11 years of contested ownership, 4 years of litigation, and 1 diagnosis that changed a man's relationship to the things he could not control. It stands in ground that belongs to no one, which is another way of saying ground that belongs to everyone, which is another way of saying that some things do not require ownership to be worth protecting. I am 43 years old and I am still learning this. The tree has known it for centuries. Edit. For everyone asking about the conservation designation process, Helen Park is happy to consult. I'll DM her contact to anyone in Ohio dealing with a similar remnant parcel situation. The county was genuinely cooperative once the survey error was established. These situations are more common than people think. Edit 2. Yes, the owls are still there. Sandra confirmed a second nesting season. I'll update in spring.